Fairchild gets out of gaming. PC sound is going to get blasted. And Sega cans Bernie Stolar. These stories and many more on this month's episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
I've been waiting a long time for a chance to say this. Stop the presses.
Requiescat in pace.
What is up, man? It's me, Mario.
Please save me.
Welcome back. I'm your host, Carl, and as always, my co-host, Peter, is here. Say hi, Peter.
Hi.
And that joke never gets old.
Nope.
No. So, are you ready to jump in the time machine and jump back to October of 1979, October of 1989, and October of 1999?
Well, of course I am. I had an amazing dinner with you and your wife, and I'm good to go.
Exactly. And we're sitting here, and there's a little less than half a bottle of port wine left in front of us. So this is going to be a fun one, boys and girls. So if we start to trail off and sound incoherent towards the end,
Just tell us, and
now...
next time we'll adjust accordingly.
You mean, and tell us if you enjoy this version of the podcast more, exactly. Because, hey, a little bit of casual alcoholism has never hurt anybody, apparently. At least not...
Dude, you know where I'm working at, right?
Yeah, okay, we don't need to go into that now. But yes, okay. You're right. This is probably not a good thing. Boys and girls, drinking is not good. Don't do this at home. We are trained professionals, or at least our livers are. So, with that being said, just a warning, as always, we'll mostly be using magazine cover dates to determine that something is September or October or whatever. And these, of course, are a little bit behind. This is going to become very, very relevant when we get to the 1999 jump. But that's just a system that we have here at the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine. So remember, send comments to us on Twitter at VideoGameNewsR2 or by email to VideoGameNewsroomTimeMachine@gmail.com. And remember, if you like what we are doing here at the podcast, don't forget to like us on your podcasting app of choice, on YouTube, and or support us on Patreon. The link is in the notes.
Not or, and.
Yes, everybody should go out and support us immediately on Patreon.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, everybody. So with that being said, we still don't have a sound effect for this, but hopefully somebody will send us one because we're probably just going to be too lazy to do it ourselves.
I'm really looking forward to someone doing the work for us.
That would be awesome. I really would appreciate that. But barring that, and also remember, if you didn't listen to it, go back. Our Al Lowe interview, we got another one coming up very, very soon. And we'll tell you who it is at the end of the podcast. But going forward, let's turn on the time machine and go to October of 1979.
And may I mention, we are on time.
I was just doing the... Yes, we are recording on the 8th of October. Really? It is a small miracle. And actually, 8th of October is interesting because there is news that we can relate to this. But... we will talk about that when the time comes.
In 1999.
In 1999. Like I said, 1999. Foreshadowing, yes.
Yeah.
Ooh, stick around, kids. Okay, so I'm going to make the weird little sound. Woo, 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 woo. And we are in October of 1979. What's our first headline?
Not what you're showing me, because this is 1989.
Oh, that's true. That is 1989. And now, 1979.
Okay, let's start. Tandy announces development of the Trash 80 color computer.
The color computer, or TRS-80 Coco, as it would become to be known, would eventually see release in 1980. Despite the name, Tandy's new system would not be backwards compatible with the original Z80, or Z80 for our English listeners, based TRS-80 models, but instead have a Motorola 6809E chip at its core. The system would get 2 additional models going forward and be discontinued in 1990.
You know, what's stalling for me as a millennial is the lack of backwards compatibility. I only know this from the console market, you know. But on the computer market, as long as you have the appropriate OS, it should be backwards compatible, right?
Well, yes and no. This is where the big problem comes in and where emulation is necessary to run an operating system on a system that is using a completely different machine code. So each of these chips, certain ones are slightly compatible with one another. This is where you get, for example, the early development units for the Super Nintendo were actually modified Apple II GSs because they both used the same CPU. Now, not the original Apple II, but the 2GS, which was using the 16-bit version of the 6502 family of chips.
Okay.
So that same 16-bit chip was the core of the Super Nintendo. So the first development kits that Nintendo sent out were modified Apple II GSs.
Okay, so a program developed for the Apple II GS would be, you could run it on a Super Nintendo?
No. They still are using different operating systems and so forth, but because the chip has the same instruction set, and I know I'm super simplifying this, but each chip is designed around a specific type of instruction. The logic gateways in the chip are the same. So you could run different operating systems with more or less limited functionality. Remember, the Apple II GS doesn't have the graphic hardware on the Super Nintendo, which was separate from the CPU that allowed, for example, for Mode 7 graphics to be displayed. But the Super Nintendo doesn't have a keyboard. It doesn't have direct access to all the tools. It will just play the software. It's also limited. So by taking an existing computer and modifying it so that it has the additional hardware, you can start to develop games for a console on that modified hardware. And basically this is what happens again and again. And as you get hardware that is using existing chips, not using custom chips, it becomes easier to make development kits out of existing hardware. So yeah, this whole idea that they're using the TRS-80 name because it's well known, and the 80 was because of the Z80 processor. But this new machine has nothing to do with the Z80. It is not compatible with the Z80. But they're just trying to piggyback on the name in a way is similar to the Super Nintendo, because it was called the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, and the original was the NES, the Nintendo Entertainment System. This was supposed to be the next iteration. They're making the connection with the previous machine, even though they're not really compatible with another, even though, as we've reported in the past here on the show, there was an original design to make it backwards compatible, to have this backward compatible adapter. And this is also the reason why they went with the evolution of the 6502 chip, which was the chip in the original NES. So there's a lot of these connections, but yeah, this is basically just a Tandy / Radio Shack doing a marketing BS by creating a color computer and piggybacking on the TRS-80 name.
So did it help them? Were they able to sell a lot of those Cocos?
I don't know how much the connection on the name did, but I do know that the Coco sold fairly well. It wasn't, game busters like the Commodore 64, but it survived until 1990. There was a lot of software developed for it.
Jesus.
Yeah.
11 years.
Yeah. Well, it gets released in 1980, so it's 10 years.
10 years.
But 10 years for this line of computers, and it really only gets unseated when Tandy goes completely into the PC compatible market, and they really have the breakthrough with the Tandy 1000 line of machines, where they basically do their own version of, I believe it's MCGA graphics or CGA graphics with the Tandy graphic card. Again, the specs on that, I'd have to look it up again. But yeah, so the Coco actually has a pretty vibrant life. They get a lot of cool games. I believe they even did a version of Silpede, which is a famous vector-based shooter, but they turned it into a sprite-based one. Why they did a port to the Coco, I have no idea, but they did. So, fun little machine. Okay, but let's move on to another machine.
Yes, the Apple II Plus is released.
The new model includes an expanded BASIC, which required an upgrade on the original Apple II machine. This would be the first of many iterations of the Apple II to appear over the next decade plus. So exactly what we were just talking about with the Coco.
Yeah.
There, it's an evolution in name alone because it's a completely new system. But here, what they're doing is they're building onto it. So instead of abandoning the Apple II completely with a whole new model, what they're doing is they're releasing a new version that's adding stuff that they've been adding as upgrades to the old one and integrating them into one package so people don't have to keep buying little bits here, little bits there, little bits there.
Yeah.
They're basically upgrading, and we're going to see a lot of upgrades to the Apple II over the next decade plus.
So, but the hardware is basically the same like the original Apple II.
Yes. The hardware stays basically the same, but what they're doing is upgrading the basic in this case. I don't know all the specs of all the things that they changed. If they changed anything to the motherboard layout, I honestly don't know. But I do know that as the Apple II line evolved, they got better connectors. If you go back and listen to the Al Lowe interview, he talks about how the original connectors on the Apple II for plugging in things like paddles and so forth were very, very flimsy, basically like the type of connectors you would have to replace chips on a motherboard. And so these things will evolve over time and get better with new iterations of the machine.
Okay. So the software you bought for the Apple II would also run on the Apple II Plus?
As far as I know, yes. That all of it is backwards compatible. I haven't seen anything about that, but I'm not the world's greatest Apple historian on this. But for the most part, up until the 2GS, most of the software is backwards compatible.
So this would be a huge advantage of Apple over the competitors.
This is an advantage that they have, that they keep this platform going, that you can keep using this. This is basically what Commodore never does. They don't really have a lot of backwards compatibility until you get to the Amiga AGA line, the 1200 line. And you don't really have this in any of the other competitors, except maybe, when you go from the Spectrum 48K to the 128K, they're backwards compatible. But of course, every time you have these upgrades, you now have new software being developed that doesn't work on the older systems. So the old software will work on the new systems, but the new software won't necessarily work on the old system because it will require the upgrades.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but that's the beginning of that long line.
Okay,
Next story.
Sublogic is advertising their 3D graphics software.
Before they became the number one name in flight sims, well, it kind of isn't a lot in the name of flight sims at this point, but they were selling high-end 3D graphics software. If you check in the show notes, there's an advertisement in Byte magazine where they're actually selling their 3D modeling software for home computers. And as far as I can tell, the flight simulator starts as just an application of their 3D software. It wasn't the point. They were actually trying to sell the 3D software. And the flight simulator just kind of springs out of this.
Has it something to do with the flight simulator of Microsoft? Because I know it's just Microsoft to be pretty popular for its flight simulator. Then they paused it for a couple of years. And I think, was it next year that they want to publish a new one?
Yes, there's a new one on the way. But yes, so Sublogic releases Flight Simulator 2. A few years later, that becomes massively popular. There's tons of mission discs. It's the famous one. You could fly around underneath the Golden Gate Bridge, around New York. Obviously, most of it's flat. I believe the Statue of Liberty is like a couple of squares, green squares in the middle of the water. But it is the first one that tries to get the physics right, that gets the complexity of flight mechanics right. And Microsoft is the company that buys up that property. I believe they buy Sublogic completely, or they may just buy the property, but I think they buy Sublogic as a developer, and they are the ones that then take over that core game engine and continue with Microsoft Flight Simulator. So it goes from being Sublogic Flight Simulator to Microsoft Flight Simulator.
I mean, I think it's a pretty nice niche to have a flight simulator, because I don't know any other flight simulator being as popular as the Microsoft version.
No, I mean, and let's face it, it's one of those things like the farm simulators where there is a very hardcore audience that loves the thing, and they're looking for this extreme level of detail where I want to fly my airplane from Dusseldorf to New York. and I want to be sitting in front of the screen for 9 hours straight. No fast forward. I want to feel the turbulence if it comes, and I want to have to adjust at a moment's notice. They want that true simulation. Unfortunately, there's not enough of those hardcore people to really sustain more than 1 or 2 offerings on the market at any given time. And so this is why it really has been this product on the market that, even though it hasn't been released for many years now, still people come back to it. And these type of simulators were a huge deal in the early years of computer gaming. I've personally, Gunship, Fighter Bomber, later on from Activision, these were games that I loved to play. I played them a lot. They were extremely complicated. They took way too long to learn how to use. And nowadays, I honestly wouldn't know where I'd find the time to be able to really get into them. But hey, that was my youth.
Hey, but I also have a story from my youth. So, there was a guy I went to school with. He's a pilot by now, by the way. And he really loved Flight Simulator, the Microsoft Flight Simulator. And every time we've met at his place, he was like, hey, you should, fly this plane from town A to town B. And I always crashed this because I was really not able to handle, just on the go, this complexity of this flight sim. He was like, I'm preparing everything for you. I crashed it anyways. So,
yeah,
good times.
I have a buddy of mine that I was a Boy Scout with in Argentina. I still remember he had this old XT monochrome screen computer, and the only reason he had it was Flight Simulator. He would practice on that thing day in, day out, and he is a commercial pilot now for the last 20 plus years. So this is where these products find their niche.
Yeah.
And it's cool that they're there. It's part of the wonderful diversity of gaming, and God bless them for keeping it going. And it's interesting to see where one of the most important simulators of this type gets its start. So, okay, moving on.
Heathkits land at
Zenith.
Thank you.
Try it one more time. The whole thing one more time.
Heathkits land at Zenith.
Yes.
I really love these sessions. I learned so much.
Yes. All these important words that you will probably never say again. So, another pioneer in home computing is being sold off. Heath Company, maker of the Heathkit line of electronic kits, is being sold off to Zenith. The company would also get passed around many times before a bankruptcy in 2012 and rebirth in 2013. Today they sell a handful of kits, components, and merchandise through their website. So the Heathkit line goes all the way back to, I believe, the 1920s or 30s.
Oh, okay.
Really gains popularity in the Depression and so forth when people couldn't afford true manufactured products. Okay. So building it yourself was a much cheaper alternative. They would sell people all sorts of kits to build your own radio, to build your own this, to build your own that. And they were also one of the first companies to get into the build your own computer hobbyist movement in the 70s.
Okay.
And this is where they're really important, because through the Heathkit line of computers, a lot of people got their start. A lot of people learned how to build these things and understood the technology by doing these very simple versions of computers with the Heathkits. And because the Heathkits were using some standardized parts, including the S100 bus, which was popularized by the Altair machines, you could add expansion cards. You could build these out to bigger and better machines. So Heathkit, no longer being really a standalone financially viable company, being bought up by Zenith, who we've already talked together with RCA was trying to get into this computer business somehow, is a sign that the hobbyist movement is dying in 79. Yeah. There's really no future in it. The standalone manufactured and factory-built computer is coming, and it's coming in a big, bad way. And speaking of the S100 bus...
Yeah, does the S100 bus still have a future?
Byte Magazine wonders what the future holds for the world's first real computer standard, the S100 bus, given the rise of all-in-one computer solutions like the PET and Apple II. The S100 bus was a standard first introduced in the Altair machines and later set out in an open source document to make plug-in cards standardized across hobbyist manufacturers.
So was it like a bus like, for instance, SATA or PCI?
Basically, yes. It works on the same principle where it was just a bus that you had attached somehow to your motherboard so it could interact with the CPU, and it allowed you to plug in all these different boards. So if you look through the magazines of the time, and again, always remember, we have links to the individual pages and so forth in our show notes. All of these things are happening. There's a lot of ads in these magazines where people are advertising expansion cards. You know, ooh, get this expansion card, it'll give you so much extra memory. Ooh, buy this. And these only work because they're all plugging into the S100 bus. Now, what I've also been noticing as I go through the magazines is that you're starting to get more and more people selling expansions not for the S100 bus, not this generic. They're telling you this is an expansion for the PET. This is an expansion for the Apple II. This is an expansion for the TRS-80.
Okay.
That is starting to become more and more prevalent in the magazines. The generic ones are dying out.
So, but the PET, the Apple, they were not using this S100 bus. I mean, I can sell you something as compatible to a Apple II. However, it could still be a S100 bus. Or
I don't believe, and this is actually a question that goes beyond me. I'd have to research it. I don't know if any of them were using the S100 bus on their motherboards, but even if they were, remember, they're in a case.
So you can't just open this thing.
Well, even if you do open it, you may not be able to put it back on because this card may stick out too far.
Fair enough.
You need to now make sure that it's all going to fit in. That little mini hexadecimal computer RCA was selling, it had an expansion slot. You could add cards to it, but the expansion slot was only accessible through a open plastic slit in the case, and the expansion card would actually stick out of the computer as a bare bone circuit hanging out of the computer if you added to it. It's not sexy, but it was a cost cutting measure. Remember, the big bulky PC compatible boxes, the old baby boxes as we used to call them, the ones that you could put your monitor on top of, those things are massive in size in comparison with the keyboard computers of the time, like the Commodore 64 and the Sinclair Spectrum is a tiny little thing. I mean, the keyboard in front of my computer right now is actually bigger than what a Spectrum would have been.
Okay.
It's taking up more volume. Now it's a little bit more extended, but still. And the Amstrad CPC is only as long as my keyboard because it also included a cassette drive built in. So this is why it is one of those things that building a case for expandability requires a lot of space. When you're dealing with the hobbyist stuff and you're dealing with manufacturers who that extra metal case around it is going to cost them a lot of money, it simply doesn't become financially viable.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, because for me, being born in the 90s, I'm used to this big ass desktop computers, and when you open them, you know, there's so much air in them and so much space, and you can put in whatever, and also sometimes non-computer related. You don't want your parents to see. So
and none of that was really a thought. For example, for me as a kid, born in '76, who grew up in the '80s, for me, computers were the keyboard computers. I still remember my shock and awe when I saw these giant PCs running in monochrome and with the PC speaker going, what the hell are you doing with all that space? Why would you buy this massive thing? And they'd be like, well, you can do spreadsheets on it. I was like, well, granted, I was like 12. I didn't understand the purpose of a spreadsheet at the point. And the fact that we had GEOS on the Commodore 64 meant, well, screw you, we don't need that. Granted, I was loading off a floppy drive, and that kind of killed it. But that's another issue entirely. Yeah, the expandability was something that the hobbyists had that the standalone computers didn't have. but it's one of those big questions. And somebody who's asking those big questions is...
Ted Lewis. Ted Lewis formulates the laws of personal computing.
Yeah, famed computer scientist Ted Lewis writes an early article laying down some laws of personal computing. He gets some things wrong, like failing to see the usefulness of an operating system or the financial benefit of creating software independently of hardware, but he gets some things very, very right, like the use, or some would say abuse, of computers by politicians for mass advertising and the elimination of whole professions through automation. And here's a really cool thing, because this article in Byte magazine, it's like 4 or 5 pages long. Again, the link's in the show notes. I do recommend reading it because it's quite insightful. Now, Ted Lewis goes on to have a pretty illustrious career running IT departments. He's taught at a bunch of big institutions. He's written a whole bunch of books. There's also a link to a blog that he writes in the show notes. The guy is pretty cool, and I contacted him and sent him some questions about this article, about his thoughts today looking back. First, he responded that he didn't even remember that he had actually written this, which I thought was hilarious. And second, he was very happy to do this, so I'm going to post and copy all of his the questions and answers into the show notes this month. So you guys can just scroll down and look at that. But it's really, really cool to see his reactions to it. The big one was that, yeah, he really didn't think that the operating systems are all that big of a problem, big of a thing. He actually calls Unix the great original sin of computers. And the other interesting thing is that he says that he completely missed GUIs, that he did not foresee GUIs happening. Really? Yeah, I asked him, had he already seen VisiCalc when he wrote this? And he said, yeah, that was the GUI basically in its infancy on a personal computer that he had just missed. He didn't see that perpetuating itself. And you can understand at this point, for most people, if you want to do something truly useful on the computer, you're going to have to write the code yourself. Everything is customized software. Right. And the idea of programs like VisiCalc coming along, professionally made software that solves problems, that is something that he just didn't see coming. And actually next month, again, a little preview, next month we're going to be talking about WordStar, which does for word processing what VisiCalc did for spreadsheets, for accounting.
You see, for me it's really interesting. I mean, basically everything has a GUI right now.
Everything has a GUI now. Everything is gone this way.
Because you need to get the masses into the computer market, and how to do this better than via using a GUI, you know? You don't want to type, you just want to click, and it needs to be intuitive. And all those big guys from back then, you know, those big brains, they were also brainy. They couldn't see how to get the dumb people into the market, you know.
Well, and he makes a good point in his article about how he doesn't see the creation of software being financially viable.
Ha! There we go again. There's no money in software.
No money in software because of the amount of time it takes to create software. He says that the development of hardware is sort of incremental. Okay. It goes phase by phase. You learn from the previous one, and then once you have the hardware, you manufacture the hardware. It's something you can sell.
Okay. Software,
but
you have to start.
He is still seeing software as each program is limited to the specific function of it needed by its creator.
Okay.
So the idea of general purpose software that will be usable by many, many people for many, many functions, is what he is missing at this point. And I think he's very honest about he just didn't see it coming. The idea that you were going to be able to create a program like VisiCalc and that it would be generic enough for everybody to use it. The fact that we today, as we're doing this, all the notes for the show are in a spreadsheet. We're doing them on Google Docs using Google Sheets. Yeah. That isn't what VisiCalc was originally thought to do. All it does, though, was put data into fields. The fact that we're using it to organize notes wasn't foreseen, but it is a use of this generic software.
Yeah.
By creating an open framework, you open up a much larger market than you would have had otherwise. And that is something that at this point in time is just starting to be discovered. You're just starting to realize that this is something that can be done with software, that software is versatile enough to do that, that we're getting away from the mainframe programs where some engineer from IBM would be thinking up some program or being given a task and creating one specific process to do one specific calculation. This is now dying. This is now the moment where we shift from very, very specific, do your own, write your own basic program to buy a program off the shelf that basically does everything. And you won't use all the functionalities of it. There'll be a ton of aspects of the program you will never touch. And that's okay, because that versatility of the tool, the software tool, allows for the sale of that software tool to a multitude of additional people. And that in turn reduces how much you have to charge per copy of the program and distributing the cost of producing it.
I think from a societal point of view, it also is a nice way to see the shift from industrialization, where you have those machines that are designed for one specific purpose, to digitalization, where you can use whatever you have for a variety of purposes. Basically what you said is just, a new time is coming.
A new time is coming, and the true revolution, the home computer revolution, is going to be software driven.
Yeah.
So, moving on to things that will create the home revolution.
Exactly. Texas Industries tries
Texas Instruments. Instruments.
I was still stuck in the
TI is
mode.
no.
I was
you got it.
Stuck in the past.
And I just wrote TI there. You could have just said TI.
I could have. And now we're entertaining the masses.
Go for it. Entertain the masses.
TI tries to convince the FCC to change its regulations.
Now, Texas Instruments, the big bad dog. We've talked about this a few times in the last few months. Everybody's wondering, when is TI going to enter? And we talked about the TI 99.4 that was shipped with a monitor, making it a massively expensive machine. Well, we are getting news this month that TI has put in a request to the FCC to change its regulations concerning RF radiation.
Talking about lobbyism?
Yes.
Definitely.
So they've asked them to change the way they're regulating it. Now, the FCC regulations at this point, Federal Communications Commission in the United States, and remember, we've talked about this a little bit, the German market doesn't really exist. The European market for computers is extremely nascent. The Japanese market is its own completely isolated thing due to kanji and everything else. So most of the big movers and shakers are in the U.S. That means if they want to sell in the U.S., they are subject to the FCC regulations. And most of the FCC regulations stem from decisions the FCC made in the late 60s and early 70s, and those were primarily targeting devices that would be used later for video reproduction. RCA's video disc, VCR, Betamax, and so forth. The decisions the FCC is about to make, and they actually make it in make the decision in October, and doesn't get reported in the magazines until November, and we will talk about it in length next month. But those decisions will be key. And actually, and this is a little preview for everybody, we do have one of our listeners, Quarter Past on Twitter. He is going to be doing a special sitting with us. We're going to have this as an extra episode, kind of like an interview episode, in between, where he's just going to give us a brief history of the FCC regulations, the impact of the big changes that came in '79, and how that affected the market going forward. So we're going to be sitting down with him next month to do that big special. But just so you know, already here we're getting reports that TI is basically lobbying for change. They're going to get change, or let's say change will happen. Let's see if it's the change they want. But let's put a pin in that. Come back next month, and especially pay attention to our FCC special interview. But going on to the next topic.
Yes. And by the way, I really like how we are starting to network, how we're getting interviews in. I think this has to be mentioned.
I really do. I really do like. I mean, we've tried to be very active on Twitter. We've had a lot of contact with blogs and other podcasts. I mean, personally, I've been a avid reader of a lot of these sources for many, many years. Yeah. Jimmy Marr, Alex Smith. These guys have been creating content and doing the hard legwork and the research for many, many years that are even making a lot of what we do here possible.
Not saying we're ripping off.
We're not ripping them off. No, I'm not trying to rip them off. I specifically chose the format for this show as a complement to all of these other things.
Yeah.
I did not want to step on anybody's shoes. I did not want to be repeating anybody else's research. Whenever I do use their websites or their research, I link to it because I believe that it is important to to give due to those people who did the work. And the format here was specifically to highlight the evolution of a lot of these stories from month to month to see how they evolve, but also to catch some smaller stories that wouldn't necessarily be worthy of a whole episode of some other podcast or worthy of a larger blog post, but are worthy of 5 minutes of our time to just discuss and talk about and highlight as we go along. The other thing is, yes, on Twitter, the activity on Twitter has primarily been there to promote the show, but also to get to know some of the people out there. This is how we got Quarter Pass on, and he's been very, very insightful in a lot of our research on the FCC topics and a few other things. And I just really want this retro gaming community to know about us, get to know them, and to share this information that basically fascinates all of us. So, yes, that's my soapbox speech. I'm going to get off right now, and we get to move on to the next topic.
Upbeat music under your monologue right now.
Yes, some epic music. We all need to come together once more unto the breach.
And somewhat so forth. A race to the development of optical storage media.
It's on. 3 major players in the semiconductor industry are investing in the development of laserdisc-based storage mediums. Sperry Univac, creators of mainframe computers, Nippon Electric Company, creators of telecommunications and microprocessor technology, better known to us gamers as NEC of TurboGrafx fame, and Philips Research Laboratories are all investing in creating optical storage medium.
So they are basically inventing the CD.
They're looking for ways to use Laserdisc at this point. CD will be one of the evolutions of this.
Okay.
But they're looking to use the core technology of the Laserdisc for storing digital information.
So, but music CDs already existed by this time?
No. Music CDs don't exist yet in 79.
Did anything of a CD type already exist?
Laserdisc.
Laserdisc. And what was it used for?
Video.
Video?
Laserdisc, yeah. There was about the size of a normal LP, the old vinyl LPs.
Oh, really?
And you could play movies off of it, yes.
So for me as a German, this is a totally new piece of information?
No, for you as a millennial, it's a totally new piece of information.
Exactly.
Laserdiscs did exist in Germany.
And they were like this...
They were the
German,
size...
Do you really think we...
No, in East Germany, no. You guys were lucky if you saw Betamax in 1989.
See?
No. No, okay, no. In West Germany, this was a known technology. And in the West, this was a known technology. Okay. This is what would actually be used as the core of Dragon's Lair in just a few years.
Okay.
So it basically worked like a DVD where it had tracks. You could jump to the track. You could play it off. I'll show you some videos explaining the technology. It's quite fascinating.
But it was as big as a LP.
Yeah.
Well, you have to store your data somewhere, right?
Well, and this was the thing. The idea of this digital medium, which could store a lot more data than a floppy diskette, than a magnetic floppy diskette, was extremely appealing. Now, obviously, the read-write functionality is going to be somewhat dimmed, but then at the same time, the fact that you couldn't reproduce it as easily was also a possible boon for the software industry. But we're talking about massive amounts of data here, yes.
So, but you still need to incorporate this into a computer, you know. I'm just picturing a computer. It looks like a T. It has this big ass disk drive on top of it where you can fit in an LP.
Exactly.
Okay, why am I making fun of it?
I don't know, because it's actually badass. Like I have said many times in my life before, the only reason I'm a huge video game fanatic is because of Dragon's Lair.
Okay.
I literally, as a little kid, couldn't have really cared a rat's ass less about video games. They didn't look as cool as cartoons.
Yeah.
And I sucked at them. So I still remember totally being disappointed as a massive Popeye fan, putting my quarter into a Popeye machine at Chuck E. Cheese and immediately dying and not knowing what the hell I was supposed to do and being so disappointed that it wasn't just me running around picking up the spinach and hitting Bluto. But then I saw Dragon's Lair. And it didn't matter that I wasn't playing it. It looked like a cartoon. It took me into another world. It was
designed for you.
It just sung to me. And
I picture the scene right now. You were looking at Dragon's Lair and you have all these flowers around you and some music.
It was kind of like that. I mean, just imagine a 6-year-old me doing that. And right next to it was a sit-down Star Trek tactical simulation cabinet. It was an old Sega game using vector graphics, but it had digital speech. So it had a couple of samples from the Star Trek crew, and I was a massive Trekkie. So you've got me coming and going. Between that and Dragon's Lair, my two biggest passions, bright, colorful, two-dimensional cartoons and Star Trek, I was in seventh heaven.
All right. So they had your quarters.
They had my quarters.
Back to the CD. It's just, you know, for me a CD is basically, it's a standardized medium you store data on, and you can put it in basically every CD drive and it always works. But I think back in the day it wasn't the case. Was it?
Well, you don't have CDs yet.
Yeah.
They're coming. And that smaller form factor with the standardized, those are the books. So Red Book is your audio CD.
Okay.
Green Book is CDI, which we talked about last month.
Yes.
In Blue Book was CD-ROM. That's data.
This is what basically survived. And Red Book.
Red Book really survived. Who puts data on a CD nowadays? If you buy a game, it's on a DVD.
Yeah, well, but it survived up to like 10 years ago.
Well, yeah, but 10 years ago is still quite a while ago. So this is why, no, it did survive, and those books, but that form factor, that's the real killer, because that form factor becomes HD DVD. That form factor becomes Blu-ray.
Yes.
That form factor has survived.
Yeah.
And that's kind of an important little tidbit, that the last form of physical media seems to have been that CD established in the early 80s. But when we get to CD, we will get to CD. Don't worry about it.
Do you know why they call it books?
Because those were giant manuals with a red cover that designated all the technical specs for it. And then when they released the next one, it was a green. It was a green book. There was the red book and the green book and the blue book. And I believe there was a yellow book and a few others. Yeah. Books. So, books, moving on.
The digital imaging era is here, sort of.
And I'm probably going to kill this, Purificon 511 digital camera has arrived. With a resolution of 32 by 32, The black and white images may be the first commercially available version of digital imaging tech in the world.
Why the hell? Do I need more to be more specific?
No, okay. And here I really do recommend you guys need to click on the links to this.
I mean, it was a small thing, so this is pretty
It's
nice.
32 by 32.
Yeah.
And we're talking black and white, literally. It's pixel on, pixel off. And what this thing could do was notice if there were light or shadow. And it doesn't seem like it's going to have a lot of utility. The article that really highlights this, I believe it's in Personal Computing Magazine. Let me check the notes here real quick. Oh, Creative Computing Magazine. It shows basically what can be recognized sort of as the shadow of a person's face, and a pointing finger. And it doesn't seem like you're not going to be taking pictures with this, but it does end up getting uses. There's scientific articles in the years that follow talking about how it was used to try to create robots that could play ping pong. It gets used this is in creative computing. They're talking about how you could try to set this up to use it to play chess, to have a robot arm recognize which chess pieces were moved. Because all you really need to know is the starting position, the change position, and then just extrapolate what was moved and what wasn't moved.
Do you need digital imaging for it, or do you just need to store the like coordinates of the chess pieces?
Well, you would have to put the coordinates into the computer.
Right. It would like make a photo of.
It would take so if you had the camera above the board and you're playing and there's a robot arm on the other side, you move a piece, and it suddenly notices, oh wait, pieces have been moved. Then the computer can figure out, compare the previous picture with the picture of the moved pieces and say, oh, which piece has moved? Where has a difference occurred? Which of the 32 by 32 dots has changed? And then it's going to figure out, oh, wait, now I can see this black or white spot. There's not another dot in the middle. Obviously, the rook has been moved, and then just has to find the rook someplace else on the board.
I mean, I totally see the use of this kind of technology. I really just don't see why would you sell a camera to the masses in how do you call this, breaks?
In brackets, in quotation marks.
In quotation marks, thank you. Why the hell would you... Can't you just wait to pour some wine until we have a break?
No. I need wine for this because you're about to ask me one of the most basic questions ever is why would you sell a technology that isn't perfect yet?
And also...
No, listen. I'll stop you right there because remember in one of our previous episodes we talked about the Creative Labs Rio. It was the first MP3 player.
Yes.
That only had like 25 megs of space on it.
Okay.
Why would you sell that? It has less than a CD worth of music on it. Why don't you just have a Discman and pop in CDs?
Because it's way more handy and you can actually store some songs on it. I can totally see why, but...
Well, you can also get a voice recorder for that, which is much, much smaller. You didn't need the MP3 player for that.
Okay.
Mini cassettes also existed already.
Okay, let me rephrase it.
Okay.
I mean, you sell stuff because there are some dumb nuts who buy it. But why the hell would you buy it?
Okay, yeah. Why would you buy it? Because you want to build a computer you can play chess against without having to put in the coordinates. Because you want to run experiments. Because you just want to push this technology. Why would you buy a hobbyist computer that has no standardized hardware for it? That you're going to have to write all the programs. That was going to take forever to do any basic functions.
Okay, so it was basically for this garage...
Remember, at this point,
guys.
Until you get VisiCalc and WordStar, these machines are basically just... cool little things to marvel at because they have virtually no functionality.
Okay.
And I'm oversimplifying, I know.
Okay.
But they have virtually no functionality at this point.
So to sum it up, you sell it because you have it, and you buy it because you can get it.
Pretty much.
Moving on.
Yeah.
This
I
answers all
mean,
my
no, it's
questions,
more
so-
than that. It's just, it is really cool. And remember, like most of these things, you will find the functionality. What did we just say about VisiCalc? Spreadsheets.
Making a
You
whole lot
find-
of people unemployed.
But you also find the functionality. It's a versatile tool that is open for interpretation. Who knows what's if you use this as a camera, as a security camera,
Okay, you just okay.
it's going to
moving
notice the
detection.
difference between in motion.
Okay, motion detection.
Remember, without a CPU, there's no motion detection. But a standard analog VCR can't be plugged into the computer unless you can digitize that image.
Okay.
But this is already creating the digital image.
Yeah. Okay. Got it.
So it has functionality. You just got to find it.
Okay.
Remember, inventing tech and finding a use for the tech. Every technology has a use. You just have to find it.
Yeah, I think I just picture those times wrong. You know, I'm grown up with those tech stores, and you have all those digicams, and you compare like whatever properties they have. But this is not what this stuff is meant for, and I'm just
you're
compared to the
you're
wrong
looking
thing.
at it from the standpoint of we've already discovered the use.
Yeah, I'm looking at it from a wrong standpoint.
From the wrong standpoint. And I mean, just think of the new technologies we have today. There are new technologies popping up all the time around us, not just improvements of old technologies. We don't know what we're going to use them for yet.
Yeah, exactly.
And in 10 years, we'll look back going, why weren't you just using it for that immediately? Or why would you even bother with that shitty version? The first digital camera I ever saw, such a blur. Unless you were doing a close-up of somebody's face, it was all just a blur of pixels.
Yeah.
But still, you suddenly had this digital image that you could send by email.
Yeah, okay.
And there you go. Okay, but our last story for 1979.
I really like that we always end with something dying. It's awesome. Today it is Channel F. Channel F is dead.
The first proper cartridge-based system has died. Or at least Fairchild, the system's creator, is getting out of the consumer electronics business. After taking a bath in the digital watches arena, Fairchild would go on, be acquired several times, and is still operating to this day as a research facility. Now, the Channel F would be relaunched by a company named Zircon with some slight redesigns, but Zircon would ultimately abandon the system in the early 1980s, but still continues today as well as a tool maker specializing in devices that detect electrical wiring, water pipes, etc. inside of walls.
Okay, so Channel F is dead, but the company still lives somehow.
Well, both the company, Fairchild, which is an extremely important company. I mean, the Fairchildren are companies like Intel and Sun and so forth. But the Channel F gets officially canceled by Fairchild. They get out of this business. They were always a research and development house. Getting into the commercial and consumer goods just wasn't a good fit for them. And they took a huge bath in digital watches. There was a digital watches bubble.
Yeah, it truly was a big thing in the 80s.
Well, we're talking... No, the bubble burst in the 70s. No, it comes and goes in the 80s, in the 70s. By the 1980s, you can basically get them in a box of cereal.
So Fairchild was getting into it in 1979.
I think they get into it 77. I may be off by a year.
And
by 79, it's already busted. Okay. They put a ton of money into it, and there was no profit. This is one of the things Tramiel Commodore also gets into this, also takes a bath on it. Price wars start, the Japanese get into it, and you go from a digital watch at the beginning of the era cost you hundreds and hundreds of dollars. By 1979, it's a $20 item.
For me, it's just funny, you know. When I was in primary school, those digital watches, I think they were called Baby G or something. Those big ass watches that were basically doubled your wrist in size.
They have no idea about what you're talking about.
Yeah, in 90s kids will. 90s kids will know, man. 90s kids will know.
Yeah, see, 90s kids may know, but 80s kids know that watches were game machines. Because we had watches that played games, and they were awesome.
Well, ours could, you could light them up in the dark, which was pretty nice.
Well, we had lights too, but ours still played games.
Yeah, but I was 6 years old by then. It was the newest shit. I was 6 years old.
Oh, yeah. No. Not cool. Okay, so that ends our trip to October of 1979. Let's turn on the time machine and go to October of 1989. Welcome. Oh, sorry, we should have done the noise. Woo, 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 woo. Okay, welcome to October of 1989. What's our first story?
Plessey introduces in-flight computer entertainment at Paris Air Show.
Plessey, an airplane component manufacturer from the UK, is introducing a new in-flight computer-controlled entertainment system at the Paris Air Show. The new system would allow users to view the current position of the plane and weather information, access entertainment options, play games, and even do online banking.
Thinking of the business owners.
Oh, not only. I mean, remember, a lot of this so if you guys have ever been on an international flight or even an inland flight and you got that little screen in front of you that's built into the seat of the person in front of you, and it gives you the option to watch movies or see where the plane is or play games, this is where it starts. Plessey is the first company to offer this type of service.
Okay.
They're introducing it in 89, and yeah, it becomes a massive market. I mean, there's virtually no big airplane nowadays that doesn't have this kind of system installed, and for a long time it was also quite a bit of a moneymaker. I remember when you'd have to pay money for each game you wanted to play, and you'd have to pay money, massive amounts of money for the phone calls. I mean, they're still expensive as hell on planes today. And even if you had internet later on, was also super slow and super expensive per minute, and so on and so forth. So yeah, this idea of the in-flight entertainment was a huge boom, and it really did improve things, because as a little kid in the 80s, when you were on a plane, that meant there was one movie, maybe two. They'd turn off all the lights. It would be shown on a projector someplace or some CRT hanging in the hall, in the corridor.
And nobody liked the movie because you had to get the lowest common denominator.
Well, no, sometimes you would actually get a halfway decent movie, but it was usually some movie that had just finished playing in the theaters.
Yeah.
And
so everyone has seen it already.
Every single time I flew, I would look in the magazine and there'd be a movie I really wanted to watch, and it was on the flights to Japan.
So why
but
didn't you
the
go
flights
to
to
Japan,
Europe,
right?
the flights to Europe and South America was usually something I did not want to watch. But you'd sit there and watch it anyway, and you'd pay $5 for the headphones because they didn't use standardized jacks, just to do that. Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it's terrible. But okay, Plessey is freeing us from that with this first version, and they're showing it at the Paris Air Show.
Okay, so you don't have to talk to your neighbor in the airplane anymore because you could focus on your screen.
Exactly. God bless them. God bless them so much.
And then smartphones came and tablets.
And they kind of took that over. Thank goodness, too. Okay, next story.
Sega introduces the System 24 board.
Standardized arcade hardware boards are nothing new, with several systems having been used previously to make development of new games easier. But the System 24 is trying to cut costs even further by allowing operators to switch games by uploading new ones from floppy diskettes. Will the always evolving world of arcade hardware stand still long enough for this hardware innovation to be amortized? The answer is really no, not really.
A good question, though. A good question.
Yeah, the System 24 doesn't have a lot of power in it. The floppy diskettes pretty quickly turn out to be too small to really put big games on. there's not a lot of games that come out for the system. There's a link in the show notes to system16.com. Great source for arcade history, and they have a list of all the games. Most of them are just Japanese exclusive games like trivia games and the like.
So, to sum it up, earlier you had, when running an arcade and ordering a new game, you would get like this big ass machine with a monitor and everything within this box. Yeah?
Yes.
And now you would only get, under the System 24 rules, you would only get just like a floppy, and you put it in the whatever machine you have, and it would boot up this game.
Yes. Okay. So at this point in '89, what you're really dealing with, most of the machines, most of the manufacturers have their standard hardware. Yeah. Sega has the System 16 board, famous, got games like Altered Beast, Golden Axe, Afterburner. Now I know Afterburner and Outrun run on slightly modified versions of the System 16, but the core idea is the same, that you would have this one board, you'd plug in different things. In addition to that, since the 80s, the Japanese established a standard called JAMA. J-A-M-M-A. And I can't remember, a Japanese arcade manufacturer or something or other.
Whatever.
Manufacturers Association. It might just be J-A-M-A. And they created a standard harness. So this arcade motherboard, computer motherboard, would have a standard plug that would plug in so that you wouldn't even have to switch out the screen and the controller. You would just switch out the CPU and motherboard. And then on top of that, you could now also change the memory. Yeah. Basically the game data. So if you wanted to upgrade from one System 16 game to another System 16 game, you would do this. But if you wanted to move over to a Capcom game, you would just take out the entire System 16 board with the RAM memory and plug the new Capcom board into the JAMA harness. And then, boom, you could have Ghosts and Goblins running. So that would be the way that you would handle it in the arcades. This is trying to take the high cost of these memory chips and replace them with a floppy diskette.
Okay. Well, then also before you had like to change the entire outfit of the arcade. Thank you. Of the arcade
cabinet.
Like cabin?
Cabinet. Yes.
You know, the thing around the monitor. I mean, there's some colors on it.
You would if you were in North America for the most part. Or you had two different things. Quite often you would just have a change of a layout surrounding the controller. Or sometimes just the marquee on top could get switched out, depending on the type
just
of
get
board.
New stickers and you put it over.
You could also get new stickers for the sides, but quite often they wouldn't even bother with the stickers on the sides. It would just change the marquee at the top.
Oh, okay.
So you'd have this semi-transparent piece of painted plastic that would have a light behind it, and that showed the name of the game. And then you would just have standard 2-button controller or whatever. Now, once you get to Street Fighter with 6 buttons, I remember seeing a ton of machines later on that would have the original artwork for the button part of the cabinet that was still from the original Street Fighter, but it would be running Street Fighter 2 The New Challengers, Super Street Fighter 2 The New Challengers, or Street Fighter Alpha. Anything that needed the 2 joysticks and 6 buttons each, you could do with that original JAMA cabinet and just keep changing the hardware inside the machine. And, you know, and they would also sell you a new cabinet with the new artwork, but
way more expensive.
Of course, a new cabinet's a hugely expensive piece, just from transportation costs.
Yeah.
So yeah, the standardization was one of the ways that the Japanese in the early '80s survived essentially the crash, the arcade crash. And so yeah, but Sega's trying to do this. The floppy disk thing doesn't take off. Later on, we do get a lot of games that are running on hard drives, but yeah, this is this.
Floppy disk is the way to go.
At the moment, yes.
System 24.
And speaking of hardware innovations...
Yes, Creative announces the Game Blaster and the Killer Card.
The Game Blaster is just a repackaged CMS, which was Creative's first attempt at a sound card for PCs. The Killer Card, spelled with K's by the way, shown off at PC Expo, yes, way before Mortal Kombat got into that game, that they showed off at PC Expo in June, would end up being the Sound Blaster. Now, the Sound Blaster was compatible with the then industry standard AdLib cards, but added a bunch of new features that would make it the de facto standard for the next decade. And yes, the Sound Blaster standard for any kid who had a PC in the 90s, you needed to have a Sound Blaster card. That was the alpha and the omega on the PC.
For me as a, basically home PC user and user of PCs for the purpose of gaming, having sound was always something that I basically just took for granted.
Yes, and unfortunately the IBM compatibles were not really well known for their sound capabilities. You just had that old PC speaker. And I also am one of those people. I still remember my first job working in a computer store in Argentina back in the late 80s. And there were some guys in the back room. They were actually doing high-end programming and stuff, while I was in the sales section in the front with a Commodore 64. And they would be taunting me with, we've got Golden Axe on the PC and VGA graphics. And I still remember them showing me Golden Axe and these beautiful graphics and running a PC speaker. And the sounds would just make you want to flinch. And then I'd go downstairs and boot up Turrican on the Commodore 64 with that wonderful little intro speech of "Welcome to Turrican, another day, another try. And remember, shoot or die." And I'd turn the sound up really loud and be like, "Can your super expensive PC do that?" Yeah, it was basically a constant pissing contest. It was fun stuff. So yes, the advent of the Sound Blaster finally fills that last gap that the PC hadn't really taken care of yet. It had VGA, it had a ton of memory, it had the hard drive.
And now it has sounds.
And now it's got real sound. And for those who can't afford a Sound Blaster...
Yes, they just use Access Software's Real Sound.
Can't afford an almost $200 sound card? Well, Access Software, makers of the leaderboard golf games, have you covered. Real Sound promises to give you digitized speech samples over a standard PC speaker.
And by saying standard PC speaker, you mean the thing whatever is inside your PC.
Well, yes, the PC speaker was actually a speaker built into the box.
Yeah, I remember the things back from the early 90s. And you have this PC and it makes this beep, 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 beep sound.
Exactly, yes.
It sounded awful.
It did. But the glory of Access Software, and these guys were really coding geniuses.
Yeah.
They managed to actually get decent sounding digital audio off the PC speaker. It is kind of amazing. There's a link in the show notes to a YouTube clip of Leaderboard on the PC running digital audio with the Real Sound system. And actually,
play it into the podcast?
I'm going to play it into the podcast. I'm just going to play it right now. So hopefully this is loud enough.
I think we need to wait so you can cut it out if it doesn't work.
Well, I can always cut it out. It's not a problem. I'm not going to do this whole section of us talking. I'm just going to go straight to the sound effect.
Can you just leave this inside and maybe not much
more? No.
From my vantage point, it looks safely in the fairway.
Yeah, I expected a little bit more.
You expected more out of a PC speaker?
No, I don't know what I expected. I mean, you praised it like it was the God on earth and...
Dude, did you hear that? That was coming off of a PC speaker, the thing that was not meant to do more than beep, beep, bloop.
I just want to mention to our audience that this guy could be my father.
Oh, but if I was your father, dude, I was having sex in middle school. I was too much of a computer geek for that, I hate to say. Yes. As I said in our Al Lowe interview, I was flipping 5 discs back and forth on a Amiga 500 to be able to play Leisure Suit Larry 5. Believe me, as Al Lowe said, seems like you had more time than sense. And he was right.
And friends. Moving on.
Oh, no. I had tons of friends. No. I'm not old enough to be your father. But that was pretty badass sound effects. You got to give him credit. Come on.
It's something that comes out of your PC.
Exactly. So, but unfortunately, real sound was not going to take off. Sound Blaster was. But
moving on. Orson Scott Card announces that he'll be working on Lucasfilm games.
Famed sci-fi writer Orson Scott Card of Ender's Game fame also has been writing a column on games for Compute magazine for quite a while. This month, he reviews 2 Lucasfilm point-and-click adventures, Loom and Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. He ends his column by saying that he won't be reviewing any more Lucasfilm games for a while because he will start working with them to create a next generation of storytelling games. His words, not mine. Card would write many of the sword-fighting insults in The Secret of Monkey Island, as well as the dialogue of The Dig. Curiously, he also got credit in Loom for writing dialogue and story. In an online forum post in 2018, Card said, quote, "I watched a demo of the game, said accurate and encouraging things about it, and then was surprised when this tiny event was treated as if I had been a consultant," unquote. So, Card is going to be working for Lucas, and his biggest contribution there is The Dig. He does end up working on some other games for other companies later on, but it's kind of cool just to see this sci-fi writer turned game reviewer / editorialist now joining one of the biggest storytelling gaming companies around.
Well, big too when you can beat him by him. However, next to The Dig, I also love those dialogues on Monkey Island. Those were awesome.
Yeah. Well, let's face it. Secret of Monkey Island is still, despite all my love for Leisure Suit Larry, still the greatest point-and-click adventure game of all time.
Yeah. Also, I remember fondly a theater play we saw about Secret of Monkey Island.
Yes. Here in Halle, Germany, there was a adaptation of The Secret of Monkey Island as a stage play. I don't know if this has ever been done anyplace else.
And I don't know whether or not they had the license.
Oh, I'm sure they didn't. No, Disney did not give them a license to do that.
I am sure they did.
But it was an absolutely phenomenal production. Super, super ingenious in the way that it treated everything. You had a circular stage. Yes, and the inventory box was a series of yellow cabinets off on the side of the stage, off the stage, and every time that Guybrush had to get something out of the inventory, everybody on the stage would freeze. The Guybrush actor would run over, grab the stuff, and then run back onto the stage, and everything would keep going as if he just spontaneously had the item in his hand, just like in the game. It was quite phenomenal.
Yeah.
I have a bunch of pictures from that show.
Really?
Yeah, there was a guy sitting next to me who was taking professional level pictures.
And you just like to talk
and
to
I
random
talked
people
to him, and he sent me the files later on. So I have an entire directory of pictures from that production. So if anybody's interested, I can post those, but just let us know in the comments or send us an email and ask us about it, and we will do that.
And
as a sign that you've actually
copyright infringement.
And also letting us know that you actually listened this far into the show. So, okay, moving on.
EA goes public.
In September, Electronic Arts went public with a market cap of $84 million. The money this generated would finance EA's Genesis development and the reverse engineering of the console. So, 7 years after its founding, as a not internet startup, but as a technology startup in Silicon Valley, they have finally gone public. And it's a big one. I mean, EA wasn't the juggernaut it is today, but it's still a big enough and more powerful enough company that it's doing this giant IPO.
And they were raising actually a lot of money.
Yeah, well, I mean, they only sell about 20% of the stock, so they only raise about 20 million off of this. But it's enough for them to get into the cartridge business. And there's a great story of the behind the scenes of what Trip Hawkins, the poker game really that he's playing with Sega, to try to get a really good deal to become a Sega Genesis developer, which is in an interview that I've included in the show notes. There's a website called acquired.fm. They're primarily a financial news website, and they did a great interview with Trip Hawkins. I can only recommend everybody listen to it because it's EA not from the game development standpoint as much as it is from the business standpoint and the foundation Trip was laying there. And just his poker game with Sega, I can't do it justice. You have to listen to it. Yeah. It's phenomenal. So, that being said, let's move on to our next story.
Yes. Sierra acquires Dynamics 3D Tech.
Sierra Online has announced that they have licensed Dynamics' 3D engine. Ken Williams, president of Sierra, says that they will incorporate it into their SCI adventure game engine.
So back in '89, they really saw that 3D is the future of gaming.
Well, yeah. I mean, we've talked about this several times, how Ken Williams is kind of a visionary in many, many regards of the business. And Dynamics is a company that already from the beginning of the 80s with games like Stellar 7 and Arctic Fox established that they were 3D pioneers. They knew how to make a fast-moving 3D engine. And while they also made several other games like my highly beloved Project Firestart on the Commodore 64 as well as Die Hard on the Commodore 64, but they also kept pushing 3D tech with Die Hard on the PC. If anybody hasn't seen this yet, YouTube it. Die Hard on the PC was basically Tomb Raider in the 80s. It's a scanned digital characters, a 2D sprite seen from behind, moving with the camera behind them through a fully realized 3D world of this building, with blended in digitized images, inventory system, and all sorts of stuff. It's absolutely phenomenal. And this 3D engine that would be used for A-10 Tank Bomber and later games like Nova 9, Red Baron, and so forth is something that Sierra has just acquired. Now, the interesting thing here, and I did send a message out to Jeff Tennell, the original founder of Dynamics, about this, and I haven't heard back, unfortunately. If I do hear back, we'll update it in a future episode. But Dynamics does end up getting purchased by Sierra, and not too long after this. The fact that it starts with a 3D engine purchase, and that there's a quote from Ken Williams, the founder of Sierra, in Computer Gaming World magazine, means that it's not just, oh, they got it wrong and they thought they were just buying this, but in reality they were buying the whole company. It shows that everybody knew we needed to do something more. Just the 2D sprites wasn't going to cut it. Yeah. They needed to push to the next level of technology, and I don't think this 3D engine ever really gets incorporated into any of Sierra's SCI games or traditional point-and-click adventure games until we get to Gabriel Knight 3 and King's Quest 8. But what does get used is, or the incorporation into adventure games, is Heart of China, which was an adventure game created by Dynamics after their purchase by Sierra, which also had some scenes where you pilot a tank, I believe, and have to shoot some stuff, which are using this 3D tech. So it's an interesting development. It's a sign of where PC gaming is going to be going, and that Sierra is on its way to becoming this much bigger publisher developer at the same time that EA is going public and also becoming a bigger and more important publisher developer. And finally, for October of 1989,
just like it hit the guys from Game Informer 1 or 2 months ago, Commodore cancels Commodore Magazine, basically from today to tomorrow.
Long-running Commodore-sponsored publication Commodore Magazine gets canceled by CBM, or Commodore Business Machines. In a clear sign that Commodore's is losing market share in North America, the company has decided to discontinue its user magazine, Commodore Magazine. The final issue, November 1989, has no indication in it that it will be the magazine's last, and continues to press forward. A nice multi-page article on classic C64 games is a highlight of the issue.
I think the staff was laid off from today to tomorrow.
It's possible. It's possible also that they just didn't bother to give them a chance or tell them to put in an editorial about it being the end.
Yeah.
I mean, remember, this is a Commodore-sponsored publication, so they were probably losing money on it anyway, and they just... It's an advertisement piece. So even if you know the ship is going down, you don't tell people the ship is going down because you don't want them to jump off the ship. But yeah, it is kind of cool.
You let the ship sink and let them drown with it.
Exactly.
I love capitalism.
Yes. So that's the end of Commodore Magazine, and that is also the end of our trip to October of 1989. Let's turn on the time machine and jump forward to October of 1999. Wee-ah, wee-ah, wee-ah. Okay, that sounded more like a French police car than anything else. Welcome to October of 1999. What? Now, and this is, like I said at the beginning, remember, these are the magazine dates. So even though the Dreamcast was released in September of 1999...
It is still thinking in October of 1999.
It's still thinking, and also the results of the launch, the U.S. launch, are not known yet, or haven't been published in the magazines yet.
Yeah.
So we probably won't be reporting on them until next month. So all the headlines, or all the stories related to it that we're getting right now, happened sometime in September and probably happened before the launch or right around the time of the launch. So please take that into account as we go through the stories. And we start with, appropriately enough, of course, Sega news. It is still the big story. Rip it.
Yeah. Sega takes the Dreamcast online.
A month before the launch of the Dreamcast in North America, Sega announces a deal with AT&T to give Dreamcast owners that subscribe to their WorldNet service a free keyboard. The keyboard will also be purchasable through Sega's online store, but according to GamePro magazine, won't be available at retail. Standard PPP online services will also be supported by the console, but non-PPP services like AOL will not be. Ultimately, the keyboard add-on would also be sold in retail shops.
Alright, so it had no advantage of... Yeah.
Signing up for the WorldNet service would get it to you at the beginning, but it's just one of those things where they were trying to create an incentive to sign up.
Yeah, and then you'll get it later. The Dreamcast had an online functionality. It had an included 56 kilobit modem.
I believe it was 56K. It could have also been 64, but I think it was 56K modem, yeah.
So could you use this modem for playing online and also talking to the people you're kicking in the ass?
I don't believe it had an audio functionality that probably would have broken the bank. I'd have to look back, but I think it just had a functionality for sending text messages back and forth. But you could play online. There was Phantasy Star Online. That was probably the most prominent online game. And I think you could also play things like Daytona USA.
Okay.
They had a version of it online, but I'd have to go through the whole list. There's probably a wiki on that someplace.
So let me get this straight. You had this big ass controller in your hands. And then you grew a third and a fourth hand in order to type in some chat messages.
No, there was actually a function built in, at least to Phantasy Star Online, where you could actually flip through a variety of pre-made messages.
Okay.
So if you needed to ask somebody for cover fire or needed assistance with something or whatever, you could just choose from a quick list, and that would send them that message.
With the PS2 and later the Microsoft console coming on, did they really think they could stand a chance?
Well, that's a whole different question about a whole different topic.
Okay.
I mean, they obviously went into it thinking that they could, otherwise they probably wouldn't have bothered. But all things considered, considering the financial position of Sega of Japan, as we've discussed several times already, the odds of success of the Dreamcast were pretty much next to zero from the get-go.
Okay. And lowering the odds even further, Dreamcast launch in Europe pushed back to October 14th.
Yeah, Sega announces, according to Micromania magazine, that they will be pushing back the Dreamcast launch in Europe to ensure online connectivity. Apparently, a deal has been struck with British Telecom to support the machine. And this is similar to the deal they had in the US with AT&T WorldNet. They wanted something similar at the launch with British Telecom to give online connectivity, or at least to promote online connectivity in Europe.
So I hear two things in your sentence. The first is they wanted to have a deal with British Telecom.
Yes.
So they pushed it back in entire Europe.
Yes, because British Telecom was active all over Europe at this point.
Okay.
British Telecom had subsidiaries in Germany, France, Spain, Portugal.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, British Telecom was a massive. Oh yeah, they were everywhere. They had bought up a whole bunch of subsidiaries in different countries. They were really active everywhere at this point.
What name did they run under in Germany?
I honestly would have to look it up again. I don't remember. Okay. But no, but that actually gets listed in the Micromania article about which countries they provided service in.
Okay.
So yeah, by having the deal with British Telecom, they covered a large chunk of Europe.
Well, earlier they were well connected, and now they're kicking themselves out. Moving on, SNK's Neo Geo Pocket will have Dreamcast connectivity.
Following up on last month's story about Sega developing for non-Sega systems, SNK will be making some of their Pocket games compatible with the Dreamcast, allowing for file sharing between the systems. Sega will also develop for the system with Sega will also develop a 2D Sonic title for the system. And the Neo Geo Pocket was basically a Game Boy. The Neo Geo Pocket Color was a little bit better than the Game Boy Color as far as the CPU and everything was concerned. And it also had a wider screen. It didn't have sort of that square screen that the Game Boy had, which allowed for games like fighting games, which was Neo Geo's bread and butter with Art of Fighting and King of Fighters and Samurai Showdown and so on and so forth. So it's a big deal for them to have some kind of partnership, and the ability to connect and transfer data back and forth between the consoles is a big deal. And the fact that a 2D Sonic game would be launched for the system also lends some credibility to it, and in a way is the first step towards Sega really developing for outside consoles.
So how can I picture this file sharing between the two consoles?
Let's say you're playing King of Fighters on your Neo Geo Pocket, and you have King of Fighters on the Dreamcast, and you unlock characters in the King of Fighters on the Dreamcast. You plug it in, and now you've also unlocked that character on the Neo Geo Pocket.
Okay. Oh, this makes sense.
Yes, it's a very convenient way of doing it.
It's like the Nintendo Switch.
Yes. Ish. Well, the Nintendo Switch is a handheld, so you don't plug it into a 3DS. Yeah. No, but this is really, you have got a handheld console, you've got the regular console, and you're switching back and forth. There were a lot of games on the N64 that had connectivity with the Game Boy Advance. Yeah. And so that's basically the same idea. And in Sega news...
Bernie Stolar gets booted from Sega.
Bernie Stolar has been sacked by Sega in the run-up to the Dreamcast launch. Just weeks before the system is launched, the head of Sega of America, an industry veteran, Stolar has been fired. Many details were unclear, but reports emerged that he was paid a $5 million severance package. It is speculated that he had constant battles with the Japanese management and that he may have even priced the American Dreamcast $50 lower than the Japanese wanted.
So you basically can say Bernie Stolar was warning the Japanese, hey guys, this thing won't sell here unless we lower the price. So he did it, and the Japanese were like, dude, how the hell?
That is one speculation. I haven't found any actual confirmation on that story. There's a few interviews online with Bernie Stolar. Again, he's one of the people that I've tried to contact to get for an interview. Hopefully he'll come through. He would be a fascinating person because he actually started his career as an arcade operator, then ends up working at Atari, is there during the Tramiel age. He actually does a bunch of work setting up software development for the Lynx.
Okay.
Then he ends up at Sony setting up third-party relationships for the original PlayStation. Then he ends up at Sega and is the guy who is blamed by many for the death of the Sega Saturn. And
why is that?
Well, there's a famous quote of his saying, "The Saturn is not our future."
Well, of course, an old console is not the future of
Well,
the company.
well, it wasn't that old of a console at the time. And it was doing quite well in Japan. And it was during a period when the Saturn was still being promoted and people were still developing games for it.
It's still not the future. The
Well,
future is the next console, whatever comes.
Well, yeah. The only problem is many people say it helped kill the system.
Okay.
And killed confidence in the system, which meant that a lot of developers who had already sunk a lot of money into the system were pissed off.
Yeah, okay.
A lot of people who heard that were like, well, I'm not going to buy a Saturn now, and I'll just wait for the next system.
Okay.
Which meant that if you already had a game out there or were shortly before launching, your install base just diminished.
Okay.
And in many ways, a lot of people blame him, rightfully or not rightfully, for the Dreamcast's poor third-party support. That so many people were ticked off by what had happened with the Saturn. Now, granted, before Stolar was there, Stolar gets hired in '96, the horribly, horribly botched Saturn launch had already happened.
Okay.
The horribly, horribly botched Saturn hardware design already happened. The horribly, horribly botched relationships with third parties from the Saturn era were pretty much already there.
So it's like a horrible story, and this guy just adds another thing that is horrible.
I don't know if what he did was horrible or if it was trying to put a line in the sand saying, Sega fanboys, don't worry, there's better stuff coming.
Just using
Stolar is just an interesting character. Every interview I've read with him is fascinating, and I'd love to talk to the man. Because I think that he has an insight into the industry, into the inner workings of it, and an attitude towards it. Because he's still in the business today, really. He still works at a consulting company, I don't know exactly what they do, but he's still active. He'd be a person to talk to.
Yeah.
So,
I just wish we could get him to talk to.
Well, we might. We'll see. We'll see if Bernie answers our request for an interview. But...
Yes.
Other related news.
Okay. The Dreamcast was just launched and the competitors were not waiting to kick him down. Both Sony and Nintendo dropped the price of their consoles.
In a clear move against the launch of the Dreamcast, Sony and Nintendo both announced that they will drop the prices of the PSX and N64 to just $99 each.
It's a catch.
This is coupled with big-name titles receiving budget re-releases, and it is clear that the market leaders have no intention of letting Sega gain any ground. And to add salt to that wound, Final Fantasy VIII was also released on 9/9/99 in a further effort to torpedo the Dreamcast launch.
And to further add salt, Sony unveils the PlayStation 2 at the Tokyo Game Show.
On September 13th, just 4 days after the Dreamcast launch in the US, Sony showed off both the hardware and first games for the PlayStation 2. And, well, it was kind of amazing.
So it basically was a stay down in the face of the Dreamcast.
That famous picture of Muhammad Ali standing over his opponent, just be like, stay down, don't even bother getting back up. That's pretty much what they're doing here.
Yeah.
They are taking the fight directly to Sega. They're making sure that this stays a two-party battle. They do not want a third developer in the mix. So the now aging PSX and N64 hardware are coming down in price. They're basically impulse purchases almost at this point. And the games are getting cheaper and cheaper. So if you do pick it up now, you've got a giant library of games to resort to. But not all is super, super rosy with those amazing graphics and super complicated geometries and hundreds of characters on screen that the PlayStation 2 is going to be able to produce.
Exactly. But also it didn't really hurt the PS2. You know?
Wait.
It didn't hurt them. That developers grumble about the high cost of the PS2 development.
That you can't tell me what the problem is before you tell me what the situation is. That's not how chronological storytelling works.
Yes, but you create tension, you know.
You don't
have
create
to be
tension,
able to
you
talk
create
to the masses.
confusion. That's called confusion.
And now you solve the confusion and people will love you. See, this is what I'm
No,
doing for
they
you.
just tune out.
Basically, laying out the carpet.
Trust me. Just stick to the script. Stick to the script.
High cost of PS2 development and developers grumble about it.
Yes. The word in development circles is that the complex architecture of the PS2 may be too costly for smaller developers to work with. While the hardware looks to be extremely powerful, studios with limited resources may not be able to hire the, quote, couple extra dozen programmers, unquote, the system may require. Only time will tell how this plays out. Or maybe it'll be a massive hit right off the gate and making the investment perfectly justifiable.
This was a rather sarcastic quote, wasn't it?
Just a little bit. But I mean, it was a hit right out of the gate, not necessarily because of the games, but because of the DVD.
Yeah.
The DVD player and the PlayStation 2 is really the big seller. The games at the beginning are interesting looking, but they're not phenomenal. It's later on when you start getting into big hits like the Tony Hawk games and especially Grand Theft Auto that the PlayStation 2 just blossoms.
Yeah.
But yeah, so at this point, Sega is just uphill battle. PS2 lives up to all the expectations, at least in the early demos. And it looks like it's going to be Nintendo and Sony in the next generation, right?
No, it doesn't, man. It was a real spectacular month, was it?
This was a spectacular month. I still remember reading this month's issue of Next Generation magazine and just going, "You've got to be kidding me!" It just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Right. Can you just imagine people back then? You know, I mean, I was
a person back then.
You know, you read those magazines like, okay,
I was in my senior year of college.
No, I'm gonna buy this. No, I'm gonna wait for Microsoft, who is developing a console.
Next Gen magazine has the exclusive scoop on Microsoft's efforts to build a game console, codenamed Xbox. Yeah, that was just supposed to be the code name.
Due to the X Club?
Due to DirectX.
DirectX?
Yeah. Okay. Because it was supposed to be running off the DirectX architecture. It was supposed to be a bridge between Windows game development and console game development.
Okay.
And the system is being targeted for a Christmas 2000 release date, according to the rumors Next Gen heard. Few details are known, but it will go head-to-head with the PS2 and Dolphin. Now, the article is a lot of speculation. The idea of a standardized hardware in line with PCs and the Dreamcast lead the authors to speculate that it could give third parties incentive to put custom platforms like the PS2 and Dolphin on the back burner. And the 2000 launch date will end up being off by a year, with the Xbox not launching in North America until November of 2001. The one big thing that they did get right, though, was the launch price of $300.
You know, on the run to the PS5 and the Xbox Scarlet, I think it's really, really funny to see all those speculations. You know, they speculate, and to be honest, no one knows shit. Just wait for them to reveal.
Well, yes. I mean, a lot of it is purely speculation. And I'm sure that 2 years out from the launch, Microsoft probably hadn't even solidified the hardware specs at this point.
Yeah.
And we're getting the same thing as we're recording this today. Well, of course. I mean, a lot of the specs keep getting modified until the last moment.
But at least you want to have some game development kits out.
Well, you have the game development kits out, and they know roughly what the chips can do, but sometimes you get a last moment thing where a slightly faster GPU will come out or something, which is something you can adjust for, and which is why that first batch of games will look okay, but won't look as spectacular as later games will.
Generations ones.
But it's one of those setups where, they may not have solidified just how big the hard drive was going to be. Was it going to be a 200 meg hard drive? Was it going to be a 300 meg hard drive?
Okay.
There's a lot of little things that are still being adjusted.
And that don't really matter to game developers.
They don't really matter that much to the game developers, or they are things that can be quickly tweaked at the last minute.
You get your 10 gigs and that's it.
Exactly. Gigs. We weren't talking about gigs back then for consoles, I don't think. I'd have to look again. But the deal is that as we're recording this today, just 2 hours or so before we started recording, Sony released the big news that the PlayStation 5 is coming in 2020. So it's kind of a weird little thing that the PS2 was basically announced and shown off exactly 20 years ago to the month that we are getting the news on PS5. It was just kind of cool.
Anniversary.
Yay, something like that. So, but yeah, Microsoft is joining the battle. They've been buying up companies. We've talked about it before. And when the Xbox does come, we will be talking about it here on the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
Yes.
In 2 years.
2 years.
But now let's go over to the PC side of things.
Yes, NVIDIA launches the first... thank you. NVIDIA launches the world's first GPU.
NVIDIA is claiming the title of the first graphics processing unit for its GeForce 256 product line. The term was actually first coined back in 1994 by Sony to describe the graphic hardware of the original PSX, but it would finally gain prominence with NVIDIA's usage of the term. So here we got a very important term being coined, GPU. Everybody today talks about GPUs, how they are in everything, and everything has this additional graphic processor that does a lot of the math and so forth that traditionally in the days of a flight simulator would have been done by the CPU. And it's
now again being done by the CPU, by the I processors. The Intel I,
Well, the Intel I have some functions, but let's face it, your graphic card is more important for your game performance than your CPU is. Yeah. And this is kind of that first big step in that direction. So, marketing. In other news.
Yes, in other news, Wizards of the Coast reveals D&D 3rd Edition at Gen Con together with BioWare's Neverwinter Nights.
In a true first, the latest and in my humble opinion, still best edition of D&D, D&D 3rd Edition got its premiere at the annual Gen Con show together with a system-compatible computer game. BioWare's Neverwinter Nights implements the new rules as well as allowing for robust online play and user-based content creation. Now, Neverwinter Nights wouldn't actually get released until the summer of 2002, but it still got its premiere at this show.
Yeah, and I have really fond memories of Neverwinter Nights. It's the first game I legitimately stole off someone. So
yes, and I unfortunately have no memories of playing it because I never actually got to play Neverwinter Nights. I was just finishing law school at the time. I was actually DMing a 3rd edition campaign, but I think the only thing I got to play at that point was Grand Theft Auto 3. That was eating up my time.
All right. Playing Grand Theft Auto 3 was eating up your time while finishing law school.
While finishing law school and DMing a D&D campaign and doing an online comic strip.
So either you're an amazing lawyer or you're a really bad one. There's no thing in between.
I'd like to think I'm an amazing lawyer, but
okay, let's stay with it.
Issue.
Let's stay here.
Yes. Just don't ask any of my clients who are currently in jail. Okay.
In jail. Stormy times.
Speaking of stormy times,
another Daikatana developer leaves Iron Storm.
The saga of Ion Storm continues with Steve and Ash being the latest casualty of Daikatana. Ash started his career at LucasArts working on games such as Outlaws and Grim Fandango, later working at Double Fine on Psychonauts, and later yet at Factor 5 on Lair, and finally at id Software on Doom 2016. Sadly, he passed away in May 2019 at just 51 years of age.
So 2 things, yeah. First, this guy was working on a whole lot of stuff. And second, I really like that you call it a casualty of Daikatana, like it's like some nature kind of force.
Let's face it, Daikatana was going through developers like a meat grinder at this point. And just look at the resumes of some of these people. These were top people in the industry. These were guys who were used to crunch. They were used to working on extremely demanding software projects. But what
they were not used to work on Daikatana.
They weren't used to working on Daikatana. They weren't used to working with an endlessly changing plan for the game. They weren't used to working under a glass bubble in one of the hottest points in the United States. It's just a sign of the potential of Daikatana due to the people who were working on it, and the way that the mismanagement of the project just wasted that potential. So yes, unfortunately, Stephen Ash, the latest casualty of Daikatana. And finally...
Yeah, Charlie Brooker foretells Let's Plays.
Before he was the genius behind Black Mirror and The Weekly Wipe, Charlie Brooker was a game reviewer for PC Zone magazine. There he would also write often very insightful as well as snarky columns. This month he has written one about why there are so few shows about gaming on TV. His answer? It's more fun to play, and the true hardcore enthusiast isn't your average player. He does make an odd prediction about how the internet will allow you to watch a Quake match in the future with a running commentary from a personality. The fact that the players themselves would become the celebrities is the only element missing from his prediction of what would become Let's Plays.
So he didn't predict influencer kind of guys.
He wasn't predicting influencers, at least not in this column.
Yeah.
But what he is predicting is the fact that watching people play games at a high level with a commentary going along with them is going to be entertainment for the hardcore audience. But the fact that television has to appeal due to limited bandwidth to a much, much wider audience than the hardcore means that you'll never be able to get that form of the entertainment on a television broadcast. But you can do it on the internet, where the people who are going to be interested can pull it up whenever they want to pull it up. And they can pull it up from everywhere. So it's not going to be limited geographically. It's not going to be limited regionally. And it's not going to be limited to a certain time of the day. And that is the insight. His real insight is there is a market for this entertainment. It's just not a market that standard television can afford financially to service. And he was completely correct.
So a new market has to be created.
The market is there. The consumers are there. The medium has to be created.
The medium, okay.
The medium was missing. And so that leads us to the end of our time travels.
The media is missing?
The media is missing. And this is where we look to see if we've lost the conversation, and we don't tell anybody that we had to re-record the last 9 minutes of this because of a technical failure known as me knocking the cable out of the microphone. So, with all this being said, any final thoughts, Peter?
Do we have something coming up?
Well, yes, you do. I'm glad you mentioned that in this casual and unplanned way. Yes, tomorrow we'll be doing an interview with a luminary and one of the earliest pioneers of the computer game industry. Ed Zeron, the founder of Muse Software, will be sitting down for a chat with us tomorrow. And we will be publishing that at some later point this month. Of course, first for our Patreon patrons. So they'll get to enjoy that a little bit earlier than everybody else. So if you want to contribute to our Patreon and get that content, please do so.
Yeah, you really should.
You really should, because, you know...
we have to live off something, man.
If we're waiting for that, dude, you better find a better thing to do. Yeah. I don't want to have to panhandle on the streets anymore, people.
Yeah,
please,
really. It's getting cold outside, man.
Oh, baby, it's cold outside. Okay, but, yeah. So that's what's coming up. We also have the FCC special coming up in November. And otherwise, we will see you guys next month. And remember, have fun.